And it's my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, is Iain Couzin. And he's a professor at Princeton University. He got his PhD in biology at the University of Bath in the UK. And he's now at Princeton at the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and is interested in how complex and coordinated group behavior emerges from social interaction amongst individuals. Please, let's welcome Iain.
Thanks, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Where's my talk? Oh, here we go. I see something happening. That's the last slide. I think you probably want to go to the first. There, that's better. Thanks very much. So I want to talk to you about various aspects of collective behavior that impact not just our own society, but other societies around the world. And, I've been fascinated for a long time in the types of dynamics you see here among schooling fish and flocking birds. How and why do animals coordinate their behavior in this way? And this is a real evolutionary conundrum as well, because these individuals tend to be relatively of low relatedness. In the first example I want to discuss with you, it's going to involve these insects here. These are called desert locusts, and you've probably seen footage like this on television. You've maybe heard about these biblical plagues. And indeed, when the swarms take flight like this, it's like a wildfire that's gone out of control. It's extremely costly and very difficult to control the insects. But in actual fact, for many months before, for about 4 months prior to being in the adult phase, locusts are wingless juveniles called hoppers. And you see them in time-lapse here, hatching out and then beginning to march across the desert environment. So we really need to understand this type of behavior, and we really had no understanding of this. And why is this important to society, you may wonder? Well, I did my field research in West Africa in Mauritania, and I'll show you some pictures of that shortly. But this one species of locust can invade up to 1/5 of the Earth's land surface during plague years. Yet it's affecting poor people, and so not much research or virtually no money is going into this problem. And that is despite the fact that the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, estimate that locusts impact the livelihood of 1 in 10 people on the planet. If that's not a collective impact on society, I don't know what is. And yet, despite that, it was admitted in the journal Science that even after 50 years, fighting locusts is more of an art than a science. So clearly science is failing us here in not being able to understand or make predictions about these type of phenomena. And so we set up some experiments where we take locusts, and they're not the smartest animals out there, to be fair to them, and they'll march around this little racetrack, this annulus arena, thinking they're in a never-ending desert environment. And this allows us, I developed software that allows us to track the motion of all of the individuals to see how they interact with each other. And what we discovered was quite surprising. These locusts are driven by cannibalism. Everybody is trying to eat those ahead and trying to avoid themselves being eaten from those behind. The outcome is what looks like this cooperative swarm moving across the desert. It couldn't be further from cooperation. Definitely coordination, but no cooperation. And I went out to Africa, to Mauritania, as I showed you before, and it's quite difficult to find these locusts in these large sub-Saharan areas, but we managed to do so, and that's me filming them, and that's us doing research. There's a camel. It's not often we do field research with a camel, so I got quite attached to it, to be honest. But then we ran out of food, and being a locust plague and all, there was also a famine. And so even though we had plenty of money, this was all we could buy, and these are camel entrails. There's a fly there laying its eggs inside. And I'd been a vegetarian for a decade prior to this trip, so I became very, very sick. And you can see how well prepared I was. You can guess which tent was mine. And behind, you can see a wall of sand moving towards us. And this is not a sandstorm, this is the sandstorm that hit us when we were in Mauritania. And so it was a complete disaster. But, got some nice photos out of it, I guess. But when we look elsewhere in the natural world, such as schooling fish, here we don't have a case of everybody trying to eat everybody else. So even though the individuals are not necessarily related to each other, we think they're coordinating their interactions and effectively coordinating their brains to allow them sort of higher order intelligence. And we can, in my lab, we've developed software that can track the motion of individuals and also reconstruct what they can see, so we can begin to understand how collective behavior is generated from taking in sensory information and translating that into motion. And so here you see real fish, and the edges, the lines we draw between them, represent real information that they're using to base their behavioral decisions. We also can use computer simulations to understand processes like decision-making. The white ones want to get to the white target, the red ones to the red target, and the green ones have no preference. And in this particular simulation, they randomly chose one of those targets. So you can see that animal groups, even though they have just simple local interactions, as was referred to earlier, can actually collectively come to decisions about where to go. And we've been very interested in how they can do this, because, of course, unlike us, they can't count. But conflicting interests, such as those white ones wanting to reach one target and the red ones another, is very common in decision-making systems. And this is one of the key challenges that we're referring to in terms of societal challenges. But failing to achieve a consensus, such as not having any government or not hiring anybody on a committee, can be particularly costly. It's been thought for a while, especially in the social sciences, that individuals may be susceptible to manipulation by strongly opinionated or extremist individuals. And this is perhaps how extremist views can percolate through populations. This has got no experimental support whatsoever, as far as I'm aware. So are those who are uninformed, who have weak preferences, particularly vulnerable to manipulation when you're thinking about decision-making collectives? And of course, one way that we resolve this problem in human society is by voting, and voting has emerged independently across the world in different communities and different societies. It means it doesn't matter how strongly I believe in something, I have the same say as you and you and you. But in animal groups or cellular groups, does this make any sense? Where individuals have very limited means of conveying a vote. They suddenly don't have the capacity to count or have a global overview of votes, and relatively local interactions. But you saw from my movie before that groups with different opinions can actually reach consensus. And that turns out to be very important. So to sort of take you through this, we want to think about systems, and there are a wide range of systems, not just schooling fish or flocking birds, in which individuals are influenced by others and also influence others. There are technological systems, there are neural systems, and of course, there is our own society. So to begin to understand how do these rules of interaction employed scale to collective behavior, we create what's called a social network, where individuals can interact on a network that you see at the top left there, with different colors representing different opinions. And just to sort of give you an idea of how these types of models work, two individuals can be connected by a line which represents them talking to each other or interacting with each other. This one thinks red is the best option, and this is, of course, just arbitrary. This could be about political views, religious views, or whatever. This one thinks green is the best option. And it causes the red one to think, maybe they're right. But in this case, it wasn't convincing, and the individual doesn't change state. However, if the red one interacts a lot with green individuals, such as two green individuals simultaneously, then this tends to influence it more. And so in this case, the individual may actually has a probability, not certain, but a probability of changing its opinion. And we can then simulate this type of dynamic on networks of 10,000 individuals interacting with each other. Because even though these interactions are simple, the network dynamics turn out to be quite complicated when we think of lots of individuals communicating. And so what we find is if the majority and the minority have the same strength of preference, then the majority will tend to dominate the decision-making in the collective. But you may then think to yourself, well, what about becoming increasingly opinionated? What about if I increase the strength of my opinion? I'm in the minority, but I want to really stick to my guns. Well, it turns out that strategy of becoming more opinionated actually tends to work if everybody in the population has an opinion. And what we found that was surprising is if we add individuals who are either uninformed or unbiased, they don't have a strong preference either way, well, you'd expect them not to have any influence on the group. And in fact, as we start adding these individuals, that's exactly what we find. Uninformed individuals don't change anything. But then we reach a tipping point where just a few individuals in this group of 10,000 that don't actually care what the outcome is, so you'd expect them not to have an influence, dramatically influence the whole population dynamic. And the system then starts to support the majority view. So having a strong opinion no longer works if there's a critical proportion of uninformed individuals in the population. And, we got excited by this and decided to test it with our fish in our lab. And we can train individuals to have preferences for two different colored targets, a blue target or a yellow target, and then just see what happens. And exactly as predicted by our theory, as we add 5 or 10 untrained, uninformed individuals, the minority is the strongly opinionated minority wins as long as there's no uninformed fish. But as we add 5 or 10, this returns control back to the majority. So uninformed individuals inhibit extremist views and promote democratic consensus within animal groups. But what about humans? You may think to yourself, well, humans are much too clever to be influenced in such simplistic ways. Here's an interesting video that was taken. So the chap in the center with the hat is a member of the public. And unbeknown to him, this is from 1957, I think, or 67, unbeknown to him, the other people in this elevator are in on the experiment. They're Confederates. So you really should look at what he tends to do in response to those around him. So you can see him paying attention to what those around him are doing and conforming to those around him. And so, under certain circumstances, us complicated humans can be remarkably predictable. And this actually holds particularly when we're in large, crowded environments. And we've been looking at socially contagious behavior, specifically how you tend to look where others around you are looking. And in particular, we were interested in whether this can allow pedestrians in crowds to detect suspicious behavior. And the reason this is important is because we suspected that the role of bystander apathy that you all heard about before is a very important factor, where people may see apparent behavior, but not actually intervene. And in fact, in none of our experiments did anyone intervene. But can we actually use the copying behavior within crowds to allow us to work out where the suspicious individuals are? And in our experiments, we did them in 2 urban environments, in a shopping street in Oxford, and in a train station in London. And we tracked not only the motion of all of these pedestrians, but we also recorded where they were looking. And we have actors in these crowds who are surreptitiously filming, or apparently filming, this environment, so performing a suspicious activity. And we found that, indeed, in the shopping street, people would tend to look more often at suspicious individuals, the black line, than control individuals, individuals that weren't being suspicious. So we could detect who was suspicious because they were looked at more often than you would expect by chance. However, in the train station, we got exactly the opposite result, whereby we have a sort of halo of gaze aversion. People would tend to look away from suspicious activity. And so we know so little about the way we actually interact with each other within crowds, the way we respond to each other, and the way we respond to stimuli. And these effects, such as bystander apathy and gaze copying, turn out to be fairly important. And so, whether we look at crickets or locusts that are impacting societies, or populations of animals that perhaps we are also harvesting, such as schooling fish, or even our own society, I would argue that collective behavior is really untapped. We hardly know anything about how it functions. And hopefully this is something that we can address in the near future.